Hey there, thank you for joining me. This is Confirmation Lesson 7, Part 1. This is Part 1 of the last major lesson in the Confirmation class. In Lesson 6, we looked at the kind of broad brush strokes of Christian history up until the Reformation. And now we get to the Reformation, which gets kicked off by the likes of Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin. The Anabaptists are also present there. And all of these figures basically say the Catholic Church went way too far and they are now in error. They are against God, essentially. And to be true to God, they need to leave the Catholic Church. They bring up theological issues that the Catholic Church isn't willing to address and say, okay, well, I am then going to leave the Catholic Church. All of that is important to know for Protestantism, but United Methodists are in an interesting place in the Protestant world because we don't descend from Martin Luther or Calvin or Anabaptists. We aren't connected to denominations like the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, Baptists, even like the Mennonites, Amish, who would be the Anabaptists that we know of. We aren't connected to them historically. United Methodists, along with Episcopalians and Anglicans, come from the Church of England, which broke separately. And when the Church of England broke off, they wanted to adopt some of the theological ideas of the Reformed churches like Lutherans or Calvinists, but they didn't want to lose a lot of what the Catholic Church did that was very valuable to them. And so within Anglicanism, there was already this sense of we're going to take from some different sources to shape our unique faith. And John Wesley picks up that and runs with it. He takes from all sorts of different sources. He even reaches into the East, and he's reading some of the Eastern writings that there weren't a lot of Christians in the West who accessed and used these writings all that much, but they helped to shape John Wesley and his thoughts. He, as an Anglican, didn't like Catholics because they were somewhat threatened. The Anglicans thought that if they were too close to Catholics, they would just get brought back into the Catholic Church. But his thought is shaped by Catholic thought as well, and by Protestant thought. And so when John Wesley asked the next great question of theology, for John Wesley, that wasn't a question of salvation. It wasn't, how am I saved? Martin Luther had asked and answered that question. We are saved by grace through faith. For John Wesley, the question was, then what? Then what happens in our Christian life? And John Wesley formed a group called the Holy Club. His brother Charles Wesley was also part of it. Charles Wesley has written many beautiful hymns, many that you might even know, including one that we're getting ready to sing on Easter Sunday. This is being recorded just before Easter. And on Easter Sunday, we sing Christ the Lord is Risen Today, which is a beautiful hymn by Charles Wesley. But these two brothers, they form the Holy Club, and they are known for taking a very methodical look at their faith. They write out rules. They make up steps. Everything is very structured for them. And so when people start to follow John and Charles Wesley, with this rigid structure for their faith, they start getting made fun of. And they get called Methodists. They're so Methodist because they have a methodical faith. And that's where the name Methodist comes from this insult that was given to the early followers of John Wesley. But it worked for those followers. There was a great revival within England following after John Wesley, a revival that changed the entire landscape of English history. England Their jail system was reformed. The Methodist movement helped abolish slavery. William Wilberforce was a Methodist, and so he's the big figure who helped abolish slavery in England. Their care for the poor in England, hospitals caring for the sick, caring for the mentally ill, caring for orphans, all of these areas of life in England were changed by Methodists. It was a huge revolution in English society, but it wasn't violent because it happened within the church. But then Methodism, it grew, it spread, and it eventually came over to the United States. And this is around the time of the American Revolution. And John Wesley kind of understood after the United States won the American Revolution and broke off from England that a movement run by British citizens wasn't going to function in the United States. And so John Wesley ends up ordaining two people so that baptisms and communion could be practiced within the United States Methodist movement. And that is where Methodism in the United States kicks off and begins to flourish. They had a structure where you would have these different meetings taking place, and you'd have what was known as a circuit rider, a man on a horse with a Bible, riding around to all of these different meetings. He would get to as many as he could in a week or so. There were times where if you were on that circuit, you might not have church as we understand it for a month, because each circuit rider had so many different meetings to go to. But they would go around and do their Methodist work. They would get people into smaller groups so that they could watch over each other's faith, take care of each other, continue to grow and learn the faith. But even this very early on, there are a few cracks within Methodism, and this will continue to happen as Methodism grows. Some of the wonderful things that happened with Methodism early on is that a lot of either African born slaves at that time, or even free Africans who had been brought into the United States, or African Americans who had become freed in the United States, they quickly took to Methodism. They embraced this belief, but they weren't treated very well. They'd be allowed to preach and teach, which gave them an authority that they might not have found in other religions, but they weren't allowed to be bishops. They weren't allowed to really rise into the real power structures of the denomination. And the African Methodists did not accept this, and understandably so. And so they broke off, and when you hear a church that's AME, which is African Methodist Episcopal, or AME Zion, these churches broke away this early from the Methodist Church because they did not agree with not being allowed into the power structures of the church. There was also a break this early on between people who wanted to follow the structure where bishops held so much power and more congregational style of church governance. And you have a break between the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Protestant Church. And then Methodism spread like wildfire toward the west, because the circuit riders would often be the first religious authorities in these frontier places. It's why I'm in Indiana. There are Methodist churches all over the place here. When you're in the Midwest area, there are Methodist churches everywhere, because as soon as people continued moving west, Methodist churches started to pop up. The denomination grew and spread, but quickly the issue of slavery became a big problem. And again, those tracts, they kept forming. So the Free Methodist Church, the Wesleyan Church, the Church of the Nazarene, they break away. Eventually, there's a split between the Methodist Episcopal Church, North and South, over the issue of slavery. And after the Civil War, some of these cracks stayed in place and some of them didn't. The Church of the Nazarene actually didn't break off before the Civil War. The cracks would continue as the church continued spreading. People felt called to serve the poor. And the Church of the Nazarene broke off in the 20th century because some people wanted to serve the poor and their Methodist church wasn't as interested. The same happened with the Salvation Army. But there was also, during this time in the early 20th century, a desire for the Methodist Church to get brought back together. So there's kind of a World Methodist Council, maybe World Methodist Church, that kind of connects all of these denominations, but there have been some joinings together of denominations. There was in, I think it was 1939, a joining together of the Methodist Episcopal Church North, Methodist Episcopal Church South, and the Methodist Protestant Church. They all came together to form the Methodist Church. During this time, there were a couple other denominations that are important to know. Early on, as Methodism spread, there were German immigrants who couldn't speak English but wanted to take part in this movement, and the Methodist Church wasn't interested. They were going to reach the English-speaking people. So the Evangelical Association and the United Brethren started up very early on, and they have their own traditions, their own unique way of looking at the faith that is extremely Methodist, but has a different history. And just like with this video, a lot of times this history doesn't get enough attention, doesn't get enough time devoted to it. I'm not the person to do that. I'm just learning their history. They form what becomes known as the Evangelical United Brethren. And in the 1960s, the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church come together, and they note that theologically, with church structure, and in so many ways, it would be wonderful if these two great denominations could come together. And these two denominations form what becomes known as the United Methodist Church. It has been said, and will be continued to be said, that the Evangelical United Brethren are often kind of the stepbrother or stepsister of the Methodist Church. Even today, you'll hear people talk about the Methodist Church just leaving out United altogether. When you talk about church history, a lot of it happens like what's going on with this video, where you trace John Wesley and that whole history, and you trace these groups that break off, and you trace this line of the church from John Wesley to the United Methodist Church, and you only mention the Evangelical United Brethren when they get brought in, but they have a beautiful, rich history that should be respected and should be brought back into the life of the church. But that's where we get our denomination today. It's a denomination that has spawned other denominations. A lot of times those denominations have done the right thing and are where they should be. Sometimes denominations have split off, and that was not good and not helpful for them. There are a lot of other denominations that are related to Wesleyans that I haven't been able to bring up here. But again, this is just a brief look at the history of the United Methodist Church. I hope it's given you just a little bit of thought. If you want to know more of this, I would really encourage you to look into John Wesley, his writings, books about him. He is a figure that stands tall and large over the history of Methodism. But thank you again for joining me for this confirmation series. God bless you. Have a great day.